Hello and welcome back to Study History with Mr. P. This is my third revision video on the crime police in an inner city Whitechapel study for crime and punishment. So in this section I'm going to look at the different tensions within Whitechapel. First of all, starting with Irish immigrants who came to England fleeing poverty and the Great Famine in Ireland. By 1861 there were something like 600,000 people, or 3% of the English population, who had been born in Ireland. 3/4 of Irish immigrants were unskilled labourers or farm workers. Many were navvies and helped to build canals or railways. Now, the living conditions suffered by the inhabitants of many of these districts were awful, particularly as the Irish community grew in size following the Great Famine. Now, owing to London's high cost of living, several Irish families frequently shared a single room. In one house, for example, in Saffron Hill, investigated by Thomas Beames in 1849, 88 men, women and children were found living in a single 5-roomed house. When this overcrowding was combined with primitive sewerage arrangements, poor ventilation and few opportunities for washing of either bodies or clothes, then the mortality rate among London's Irish population rose to frightening levels. As I've already said, many Irish immigrants were also from rural and agricultural backgrounds. This left them ill-prepared for life in a large city. Complaints about Irish families keeping pigs and about the sanitary implications of Irish funerals were commonplace. They were victims of racial and religious discrimination, because most were Roman Catholics, and in 1846 and for many years after there were anti-Irish riots. This increased due to a group of Irish nationalists known as Fenians who demanded Irish freedom from UK rule. There was also Jewish immigration into Whitechapel in the 18th century. In the second half of the 19th century, in response to the Russian famine of 1869-70 and the threat of conscription during the Russo-Turkish War of 1875-6, a new wave of poorer Eastern Europeans and primarily Russian Jews arrived in London. These immigrants were then followed by many more, driven from the Russian Empire and Prussia in the early 1880s and 90s by the pogroms and anti-Jewish agitation. Now, the Jewish immigrants found it hard to integrate due to language barriers and cultural differences, and they often became separate from the wider community. Most went to live in the slums in the East End of London, and resentment of Jews by the local population occurred for a number of reasons, including they seemed to find work or set up businesses quicker than poor working-class locals. The newly arrived immigrants accepted lower wages from established Eastern European immigrant workers in their sweatshops. Jewish immigrants ran a sweatshop model of businesses, and other businesses which followed government rules could not compete with this. The Jewish holy day was a Saturday, so they could work on Sundays, and they stood out with their religious rules about food and clothing. Mixed in with these tensions from immigrants was also a growth of socialism and anarchism. So anarchism was developed by Russian revolutionaries, which made the authorities and locals suspicious of Jewish workers who became in turn a target for prejudice. And socialists were another potentially revolutionary group. The SDF, the Social Democratic Federation, founded in 1881, wanted a revolution to bring down the capitalist system. It was involved in the Bloody Sunday protest in Trafalgar Square in 1887. And generally, the authorities feared socialist groups who wanted shorter working hours and better pay. So this all leads us to rising tensions. So the high unemployment and acute housing shortage brought national attention to the East End of London. Sweatshops were investigated. Their conditions were against the law, but language barriers prevented the police from doing much to stop them. And this was a time of conflict and crises, such as the Jack the Ripper murders, which will feature in my final video. There was a lot of anti-Jewish Semitism, and many believed Jack the Ripper could not have been an Englishman, which led to even more racial hatred and some stereotyping of him perhaps being a Jew.